Hector Berlioz's pursuit of the Irish actress Harriet Smithson reads like a 19th century stalker's handbook. He watched her from afar, bombarded her with letters, and even composed a symphony inspired by his obsession. Against all odds, they actually married. But little did Berlioz know that marrying his dream girl was a grave mistake that would leave him a bitter and broken man. Hector Berlioz, the brilliant yet volatile French composer, stood at the forefront of the Romantic movement in classical music. His innovative orchestrations and dramatic compositions would revolutionize the musical landscape of 19th century Europe. But in 1827, he was merely a young man of 23, his genius yet unrecognized. Enter Harriet Smithson, a 27-year-old Irish actress who had taken Paris by storm. Her captivating performances of Shakespeare's heroines had enthralled audiences and critics alike. Little did she know that her talent would set in motion a pursuit bordering on mania. On one fateful evening in September of 1827, Berlioz attended a performance of Hamlet at the Odeon Theatre. It was here that he laid eyes on Harriet for the first time. As Harriet embodied the tragic Ophelia, Berlioz was immediately captivated by the actress. His infatuation reached new heights when he attended her performance as Juliet in Romeo and Juliet just days later. Onlookers noted the intensity of Berlioz's gaze, describing his eyes as fixed on Juliet with the expression of ecstasy. It didn't take very long for his infatuation to crystallize into an all-consuming obsession. He couldn't eat nor sleep. For a while, he'd even lost interest in composing. His thoughts were singularly concentrated on Harriet. His friends described how he'd wander the streets of Paris in a daze, thinking of nothing but his fair Ophelia. As Berlioz's obsession with Harriet Smithson grew, so too did his determination to win her affections. He bombarded her with passionate love letters, pouring his heart out onto paper. Unfortunately, these declarations of love fell on deaf ears, or more accurately, uncomprehending eyes, as Harriet was unable to read French. And besides, seeing as how she was a famous actress, she didn't exactly feel compelled to pay attention to some crazy 23-year-old student who seemed like just another fervent admirer among many. The lack of a reply did little to deter Berlioz, whose behavior would soon become questionable, to say the least. He began stalking her at the theater. He rented a room in the apartment directly across from hers, where he could observe her daily routines with unsettling precision. He would watch her enter and exit her carriage, noted the times her bedroom light flickered on and off, and even tracked the movements of her shadow behind her window's shutters. He began studying English, attending classes 3 times a week in a desperate bid to bridge the communication gap. Unfortunately for him, the flood of letters he sent her way, despite being written in her native tongue, still went unanswered. Finally, in an utterly desperate move, Berlioz went so far as to befriend the manager of Harriet's apartment building, hoping to glean snippets of news about her life. Curiously, it was this manager who informed Berlioz that Harriet had given strict orders to her servants to not accept any more letters from him. As it turned out, Harriet was thoroughly alarmed by the advances of this obsessive admirer. Berlioz had hoped for a romantic reception. Instead, he seemingly did everything in his power to scare off his beloved. One time, during an open rehearsal of Romeo and Juliet, Berlioz completely lost his composure and shrieked at the sight of Juliet in Romeo's arms. This outburst prompted Harriet to warn her fellow actors to beware of the gentleman with the crazy eyes. Harriet's rejection only seemed to fuel Berlioz's fixation. His writings from this period revealed the depths of his emotional turmoil.
Will she know me? Will she understand the poetry of my love? Oh, Juliet, Ophelia, Belvidera, Jane Shaw. Names that hell repeats unceasingly.
Meanwhile, Harriet's discomfort with Berlioz's attention was obvious to all, except him. She struggled to understand his persistence, unable to fathom why and how she'd become the target of his relentless pursuit. As Berlioz's infatuation with Harriet Smithson reached its peak, fate conspired to test his resolve. In 1829, Harriet departed Paris for London, leaving the young composer in a state of deep despair. His obsession, once fueled by her physical presence, now burned even hotter in her absence.
Today, it is a year since I saw her for the last time. Oh, unhappy woman. Oh, I loved you. How I love you.
What would it take for Berlioz to break free of this all-consuming fixation? The answer to that question would emerge in the form of an 18-year-old girl who would soon catch Berlioz's eye and provide him with a much-needed glimmer of hope. Camille Moke was an exceptional pianist and former child prodigy who taught at the all-girls school where Berlioz was employed. They were introduced by a mutual friend and soon became quite close, although the feelings were somewhat lopsided, with Camille being far more attached. At this point, Berlioz had not yet rid himself of thoughts of Harriet. Camille, wanting Berlioz for herself, didn't hesitate to pass on a bit of unfavorable gossip about Harriet. Rumor had it that during her tour in London, Harriet was carrying on an affair with her manager. Whether or not it was actually true didn't matter. Camille had an agenda, and so she did what she had to do. And it worked. In an instant, Berlioz was freed from the shackles of his obsession. With Harriet now banished from his mind, his feelings soon turned towards Camille. He wrote to his friend,
Since my recovery, I loved her. But she had loved me long before the Hydra left my heart.
Within weeks, they began speaking of marriage. Before the year was out, they were engaged. With the fog of infatuation lifted, Berlioz was able to channel all of his creative energies into composition. The gossip about Harriet had tarnished the idealized image he had constructed of her, permitting him to depict her in a less flattering light in his new composition, a symphony unlike any that had come before it. The result was the Symphonie Fantastique, a groundbreaking work that tells a story of passion, despair, and madness. Its program, described by Berlioz himself, follows a vibrant young musician who sees for the first time a woman who unites all the charms of the ideal person his imagination was dreaming of and falls desperately in love with her. This woman, clearly inspired by Smithson, is represented by a recurring melody that Berlioz called an idée fixe. This musical motif haunts the protagonist throughout the symphony, appearing in various guises across its 5 movements. The symphony's narrative unfolds like a fever dream. We track the musician as he encounters his beloved at a lively ball. And then in a serene countryside, each setting amplifying his intense emotions. Overwhelmed by his unrequited love, he descends into despair, resorting to opium in hopes of escape. But relief eludes him. Instead, he spirals into a nightmarish hallucination where he dreams of murdering his beloved and being led to his execution. The final movement plunges the listener into hell itself, where a witch's sabbath unfolds. Amidst demonic laughter and eerie chants, the idée fixe returns, now in the form of a grotesque dance tune, mocking the protagonist. Here, he sees his beloved among the revelers, joyously partaking in the ghastly celebration of his doom. The symphony closes on this chilling note, leaving the audience both disturbed and awestruck by its raw, emotional power. The premiere of the Symphonie Fantastique at the Paris Conservatory on December 5, 1830, was nothing short of a sensation. At the end of the performance, the audience, which included several celebrities, went crazy, demanding an encore and clamoring to see the work's composer. The event marked a turning point in Berlioz's career. Just a few months earlier, he'd made a solemn promise to himself about Harriet.
I will show her that I am also an artist.
And show her he did, as the symphony catapulted him to fame and established his reputation as a composer of note. But just as things were looking up for Berlioz, his personal life once again came crashing down. His engagement to Camille Moke ended abruptly and in the most dramatic fashion, pushing him to the brink of committing murder in reality. After learning of Camille's intentions of marrying an older, richer man, Berlioz, in a fit of rage, loaded up 2 double-barreled handguns and set out to kill Camille, her mother, her innocent fiancé, and then himself. Fortunately, on the way to his destination, he cooled off and abandoned his catastrophic plan at the last minute. With his engagement in tatters, Berlioz's thoughts inevitably returned to Harriet Smithson. His obsession, temporarily subdued, reignited with renewed intensity. It was as if his muse, having inspired his greatest work, now demanded to be acknowledged once more. Unfortunately, fate was preparing a cruel twist for the object of his obsession. Harriet Smithson, once the toast of Paris, whose portrait could be found in the windows of gift shops throughout the city, found herself facing a stark reversal of fortune. She returned to Paris from London in the spring of 1830, only to discover that the public was no longer interested in her. The leading actress, who had once held audiences spellbound, now found herself relegated to performing minor roles. The demand for Shakespeare had waned, leaving Harriet without the roles that had defined her career. As her professional life crumbled, so too did her financial stability, with mounting debts casting a long shadow over her future. In a desperate bid to salvage her fortunes, Harriet embarked on a new business venture, setting up her own acting company. However, like her acting career, this too was destined for failure. The enterprise quickly floundered, leaving Harriet further mired in financial distress. As if things couldn't get any worse for Harriet, she'd broken her leg after falling out of her carriage, leaving her with a limp that would plague her for the rest of her days. One can only imagine the despair she must have felt as she faced this flurry of personal and professional setbacks. Little did Harriet know that while her star was fading, the young man who had once stalked her from afar was now basking in the glow of success. Berlioz, the gentleman with the crazy eyes, had transformed from an obsessed admirer into a celebrated composer. The irony of their reversed fortunes would soon become apparent to her in a most unexpected way. On December 9th, 1832, curiosity led Harriet to attend a performance of the Symphonie Fantastique conducted by Berlioz himself. As she took her seat at the front of the stage, she found herself at the center of attention, with the entire room seemingly fixated on her presence. The whispers and stares must have been unnerving, but Harriet could not have anticipated the revelation that awaited her. Unbeknownst to Harriet, the symphony she was about to hear was no ordinary piece of music, but after learning of the program behind the work, she began to realize what the whole of Paris already knew. The Symphonie Fantastique was about her. This sudden realization must have stirred complex emotions within Harriet. Here was tangible proof of the impact she had made, not just on one man, but on the world of music itself. Perhaps she felt a mix of flattery, confusion, or even a twinge of regret for having dismissed Berlioz's advances years earlier. Whatever her initial reaction, it marked a turning point in their relationship. The day following the concert, Harriet agreed to meet with the composer. One can only imagine the intense emotions Berlioz must have felt finally facing this long-awaited encounter. Within weeks, what had once been a one-sided obsession blossomed into a mutual courtship. The tables had indeed turned, with Harriet now taking an interest in the man she had once feared and dismissed. As Berlioz's long-held dream of winning Harriet Smithson's affection seemed to materialize, a new chapter in their turbulent saga was about to unfold. One might wonder, did Harriet's interest stem from genuine affection, or was it influenced by her own declining fortunes and Berlioz's rising status? And as for Berlioz, the composer's persistence had finally paid off, but would the reality of their union match the fantasies that had occupied his mind for so long? It wouldn't be long before the answers unfolded, as the two would soon be engaged. The path to matrimony was far from smooth for the unlikely couple. Both of their families vehemently opposed the union, Even Harriet herself harbored reservations about marrying the man who had once stalked her, but Berlioz was not about to let his fair Ophelia slip from his grasp. In a move that would be considered completely unhinged by today's standards, Berlioz staged a dramatic suicide attempt in August of 1833. He overdosed on laudanum in Harriet's presence, subjecting himself to 2 hours of violent vomiting and 3 days of sickness. The outcome was as intended. Whether moved by genuine concern or manipulated by his extreme gesture, Harriet finally acquiesced and agreed to marry him. On October 3, 1833, Hector Berlioz and Harriet Smithson were wed. The composer's own words capture the precarious yet triumphant nature of their union.
On the day of our marriage, she had nothing in the world but debts and the dread that her accident had disabled her from appearing on the stage again. My property consisted of 300 francs, borrowed from my friend Gounet, and the fresh quarrel with my parents. But she was mine, and I defied the world.
The initial excitement of their union was soon complemented by the joy of parenthood. In 1834, Harriet gave birth to their son, Louis Thomas, adding a new dimension to their relationship. In these early days of their marriage, one can imagine Berlioz's elation. After years of yearning, his fair Ophelia was finally his wife. The composer who had poured his unrequited love into the Symphonie Fantastique now had the living, breathing inspiration by his side. It must have seemed, for a fleeting moment, that his long-held dream had at last become a reality. Or did it? Beneath the surface of this apparent domestic bliss, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. The woman he had worshipped from afar for so long would soon reveal herself to be far more complex and far more human than the perfect creature of his imagination. The first cracks in their marriage were due to the ever-present issue of their language barrier. Berlioz, in his own words, did not know a syllable of English, while Harriet's grasp of French was mediocre at best. One can only imagine the frustration and misunderstandings that arose as the pair attempted to navigate the complexities of married life with such limited means of communication. But linguistic challenges were merely the tip of the iceberg. As their marriage progressed, a far more insidious problem began to take root. Harriet, perhaps struggling to cope with her fading career and the pressures of being married to a rising star, turned to alcohol for solace. Her drinking soon spiraled out of control, transforming the once graceful actress into a volatile and abusive partner. Berlioz's words to his sister paint a harrowing picture of their domestic life.
An existence like this is impossible. There are shouts and abuse and curses and recriminations so revolting, so absurd, that they would drive me demented if I didn't know the cause of this lunacy. She gets up in the middle of the night when she knows me to be asleep, comes into my room, shuts the doors, and starts shouting abuse at me for 3 hours on end sometimes, till daybreak. The next day, she asks me to forgive her, swears she loves me, that I could trample her underfoot without affecting her love. And in the evening, it all begins again. Truly, it's unbearable.
The woman who had once captivated Berlioz with her beauty and talent now stood before him a shadow of her former self. Her appearance, once meticulously maintained for the stage, fell into disarray. Berlioz lamented,
"If you saw the confusion, her state of dress, the abandonment of every care for her appearance."
The physical toll of her alcoholism was evident, with Berlioz noting,
"It's awful. She's become vast. They say spirits make you fat, and here is the proof."
As Berlioz's star continued to rise in the musical world, Harriet's resentment grew in proportion to her own fading career. Despite her efforts to support him, her failed attempts at comebacks in smaller theaters and her inability to regain her former glory fueled a bitter jealousy. The adoration she had once felt for her husband's talent twisted into something darker, poisoning their interactions. Harriet's jealousy manifested in increasingly paranoid behavior. She began to search Berlioz's belongings for evidence of infidelities and opposed his long trips, fearing his unfaithfulness. Unfortunately, her suspicions were not entirely unfounded. During this time, Berlioz's travel companion was a young, pretty singer named Marie Recio, a woman with whom he would soon begin an affair. By the fall of 1844, the discord between Berlioz and Harriet had reached its peak. No longer able to endure the tumultuous atmosphere of their shared home, Berlioz and Harriet began living separately. In the end, the composer ended up maintaining two households, one with Harriet and their son, and the other with Marie and her mother. This arrangement, while providing temporary relief, placed considerable strain on Berlioz's finances, and undoubtedly his conscience as well. As Berlioz juggled his double life, Harriet's world took a devastating turn. In 1848, she suffered the first of a series of strokes that would leave her bedridden, partially paralyzed, and robbed of her ability to speak. The woman who had once commanded the stage with her presence was now confined to her bed, reduced to communicating through simple yes or no responses to questions. Despite their estrangement, Berlioz did not abandon Harriet in her time of need. He spent considerable time at her bedside, ensuring she received adequate care from her nurses. This act of devotion raises questions about the complex nature of their relationship. Did Berlioz's care stem from lingering affection, a sense of duty, or perhaps guilt over his infidelity? On March 3, 1854, Harriet Smithson breathed her last, bringing an end to a tumultuous chapter in Berlioz's life. His words following her passing reveal the conflicted emotions that had come to define their relationship.
I will not attempt to describe the grief that took possession of me. It was complicated by a feeling which, though it had never before been so intense, I had always found the hardest of all to bear, a sense of pity.
The curtain had barely fallen on Harriet's life when Berlioz, in October of the same year, married his mistress, Marie Recio. Perhaps he'd hoped that this union would provide the happiness that had eluded him in his first marriage. However, fate had other plans. Marie's meddling personality caused Berlioz considerable trouble in his career, proving that his romantic entanglements continued to be a source of strife rather than solace. Reflecting on his relationship with Harriet in later years, Berlioz admitted,
"We could neither live together nor apart."
This poignant statement encapsulates the bittersweet nature of their bond. Franz Liszt, Berlioz's contemporary and friend, offered a perspective that perhaps best summarizes Harriet's role in the composer's life. In a letter to Berlioz following Harriet's death, Liszt wrote, "She inspired you. You loved her. You sang of her. Her task was done." These words suggest that Harriet's greatest contribution to Berlioz's life may have been as a muse rather than a wife. Berlioz's final years were marked by loss and disillusionment. Marie Recio died 8 years after Harriet in 1864, and his son and only child, Louis Thomas, died in 1867. When Berlioz himself died in 1869, he left this world as a sick, frustrated, bitter, and broken man. The passionate composer who had once pursued love with such fervor had been brought low by the very emotion that had fueled his greatest work.